The United States is getting increasingly secular, right? And so we're moving away from religion in general. But there are pockets that are growing, and I think there's kind of a natural hunger for a relationship with God. I think that's part of who we are. And I think you do see that today, people looking for a sense of spirituality, if not religion.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today we are talking about religion in America and around the world. And that's because the biggest religion story of the year has to do with America and the world. Yes, I'm talking about Pope Leo XIV, the world's first, maybe not the last, American Pope. By now, you've probably read 100 pieces on the man himself, on his flawless Spanish, or his deeply flawed White Sox fandom, but I'm more interested in the geopolitical implications of his ascendancy. President Trump, for instance, has already suggested that Pope Leo could maybe mediate peace between Russia and Ukraine, since Trump can't do it. And beyond the man himself, what can the world's first American Pope tell us about religion in America today? To talk about all that and more, I'm joined by Father James Martin. He's a best-selling author and Jesuit priest who knows Pope Leo personally. But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on.
Funding for GZERO World is provided by our lead sponsor, Prologis, and by Cox, a family of businesses. Additional funding provided by Jerry and Mary Joy Stead, Carnegie Corporation of New York, and
Are you there, God? It's me, America. Let me edit that famous Judy Blume book title to make a point. Americans want to believe. It's not a question. That's a fact. According to a Pew survey that I'll return to in a moment, 92% of Americans believe in the existence of a soul or something beyond the natural world. But how they practice those beliefs is complicated. It's a big topic, so I'll break it down into a tale of two different surveys. Let's start with the long view. When Gallup first asked Americans in 1965, is religion very important to you? 70% responded yes, 7% responded no. By 2023, the yeses had dropped to 45%, the nos up to 28%. That same survey also showed that less than half of Americans in 2023, 45%, belonged to a formal house of worship. When Gallup first asked that question back in 1937, 73% said they were members of a church. So there you go, data points telling the same story of a country sliding into secularism over the better part of the last century. But you remember that Pew survey I started with, the one that showed that 9 in 10 Americans today are spiritual? Turns out, it's the largest survey Pew has ever conducted. 37,000 respondents compared to the typical 1 to 2,000. Offers a fascinating snapshot of religious stabilization in the last 5 years in the United States. Shows a steady decline in the Christian share of the adult population from 78% in 2007 to 71% in 2014, no surprise. But it also shows it leveling off in the past 5 years, right at that 62%. Also shows that since 2021, the percentage of Americans who say they pray every day has held consistent around 45%. Doesn't say what they pray for. And it shows that since 2020, the number of Americans who attend religious services monthly also remained consistent, about 33%. So how do we reconcile the Gallup and Pew surveys? Easily. Over the long term, religion has declined in America. But in the short term, Americans need God. It might even be making a comeback. Maybe all of that doom scrolling on our couches during the pandemic made us yearn for community and connection that religion can provide. Or maybe the places where we've sought communal connection in the past, like in our corner bar or the bowling alley or the weekly spin class, Soul Cycle, there you go, just aren't cutting it. Americans today are as spiritual as they've ever been, give or take, but now they're willing, for the moment at least, to maybe reconsider organized religion. And then there's politics in both Washington and Rome. In a MAGA-controlled U.S. Capitol, conservative Christianity is ascendant. And in the Vatican, the world's first American Pope has reinvigorated the Catholic Church here at home. Joining to talk about that and more is a man who has met Pope Leo himself and who has dedicated his life to spreading the gospel Jesuit priest and best-selling author, Father James Martin. Father James Martin, great to have you back on the show.
Good to be back.
A little bit of news in your place.
Yep, got a new boss.
Yeah, how do you feel about that?
He's great. I knew him a little bit before his election, and I think he's very open, he's modest, he's humble, soft-spoken, but as one of his Augustinian brothers told me, not a pushover.
Now, you were in Rome at the time of the conclave. When it's going on, of course, no one is saying anything. As soon as it's over, everyone's saying everything. What was it like? What was the buzz from people inside, for people talking to folks inside after the decision was made?
After the decision, people were basically scrambling to find out who this guy was. He was known. He was on a lot of people's lists. I would say if you asked me at that time, I would have said maybe 6 or 7, kind of a compromise candidate. But he wasn't as well known as some of the other contenders. So yeah, just people digging into his background. And I think the more they found out, the more impressed people were. Believe it or not, because he spoke English, I think appealed to a lot of people. Appealed to people from the Far East, for whom Italian isn't a natural language, English-speaking Africa. The Latin Americans loved him because he was in Peru for a long time. And I think people just really respect him. He's a very holy guy. And I think within 4 ballots, he was the man. So it happened pretty quickly from what I hear.
Now, you just said he's a very holy guy. I would think that just about anyone you would pick would be considered a very holy guy. What does it mean for you to say that?
It's someone whose life is centered on Jesus. He's humble. His whole world has been serving others. He's very modest. And I think he's someone who I think that you could see immediately as holy. That's my sense. When I met him, I found him a very prayerful person. And yeah, everybody is in their own way, but he's, I would say, demonstrably so. It's obvious when you meet him, he's a real person of prayer.
And you've spent a fair amount of time with him before he became Pope. I understand you've told me he's quiet, he doesn't say much, and generally a social environment, but he certainly has views. What did you take away from him in terms of kind of things he thought about the church and the role the church should be playing?
We don't have to guess because he's told us in 2 ways. One, with his choice of name, Leo XIV, which is a nod to Leo XIII, who was the father of Catholic social teaching, so standing for the workers, rights of the poor. But also he's been pretty open in his speeches to cardinals and other diplomats about what he wants to do, to continue the legacy of Pope Francis, to continue the legacy of Vatican II, to stand up for those who are suffering. So he's been already pretty blunt about where he wants to lead the church.
He's made already some statements on Russia, Ukraine, on Israel, Palestine. Do you see Pope Leo as someone that is likely to play an active diplomatic role globally?
Yeah, I think any pope is called upon to play some sort of diplomatic role. He has mentioned peace many times, and so he's, I think, offered, as far as I know, the Vatican as a place for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. But I wouldn't be surprised if peace and peacemaking and peace building was a part of his papacy. But really, that's every pope. I mean, his first message on the balcony after his election was, "Peace to all of you."
La pace sia con tutti voi.
So that literally his first words to the world and to the church are peace. So I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't a real theme of his papacy.
The world is not replete with peace these days. What does the Catholic Church need to do? What kind of leadership should the Catholic Pope play to help change the trajectory that the world seems to be on right now?
I think the first place to start might be within the church. There are different competing factions, and so bringing peace to the church, bringing a sense of unity, which he has talked about. But really, he's continuing the legacy of, every modern pope. John the 23rd wrote an encyclical called Peace on Earth during the Cold War. Paul VI said, if you want peace, work for justice. John Paul was obviously very involved in peace. So was Benedict, so was Francis. So it's nothing new for the Pope to get involved in peace. We want an end to war. The great quote, one of the great quotes from St. John Paul is, "War is always a defeat for humanity." And so this has been a consistent theme of popes, and it will be for Pope Leo.
People talk about him as the first American pope. He's not only an American pope, of course. Do you think of him as an American pope, and what does that mean to you?
Well, funny enough, I was corrected a number of times for saying American Pope. They say, well, Francis was from the Americas too. So I guess we're supposed to say the first U.S. Pope. But absolutely. I think he's going to inject new life into the American church. I also think he's the one to really bridge the gap between the right and the left, the progressives and the traditionalists in the U.S. church. I think U.S. church leaders and politicians and even Catholics aren't going to be able to say that the Pope doesn't understand the United States or doesn't understand the United States church. So I think he's going to be a real leader. And it's very exciting. I mean, imagine him going to Chicago, right? Going back to Chicago, going to Villanova. It's actually hard to describe since we've never had it, but I think he's going to be a real shot in the arm for the U.S. church.
I mean, Americans go crazy for any pope when they come to the United States, right? I mean, and that's been true as long as I've been alive. But it is probably electrifying, right? In the sense that not only there are a lot of Catholics, but most Americans, in fact, the vast majority of Americans, consider themselves spiritual.
Sure, and so
90%.
Yeah, and thank God, I would say. And he's a moral leader just by virtue of the fact that he's been elected Pope. But I think to have someone who can speak English, speaks American English, really removes the distance between Catholics and the Vatican. You know, the Vatican is seen as kind of this foreign, strange place where the Pope speaks with an accent, and even when they speak English, right, it's accented. So I think it just sort of lessens the distance between the average Catholic and the Vatican, which means it lessens the distance between the average Catholic and the Church, and therefore God, because people, make that connection. So I think it's a great spiritual move.
You started when I asked about the Pope bringing peace. The first thing you said was about competing factions inside the Church. Brought it back inside. How does it feel? You're obviously on one side of that, right? I mean, you've been very outspoken for a lot of progressive rights and a lot of reform inside the Church. How does it feel today, the Catholic Church? What does it mean for there to be conflict inside the Church?
Well, it's against what Jesus wants. Jesus says that they all may be one. We're supposed to be a sign of unity, and it's a real pain for a lot of people. And it's a pain for me, that there's so much division in the Church and anger. And there was a lot of critique leveled at Pope Francis, which I thought was really unfair. So that was really divisive, I thought. But I do think Pope Leo has the ability and the capacity and the opportunity to really bridge these gaps. I think there are ways that he's already reached out in different gestures to traditionalists and progressives. He's more and more traditionalist, I would say, vesture, right? When he came out on the balcony, he was
traditional.
Wearing the mozzetta and the cross. He sang in Latin, the Regina Caeli.
He's gone back to the papal apartments.
He has, yeah. And yet he's also said that he wants to continue Pope Francis's legacy. So I think there's already, in the first few days, this sense of trying to build those bridges, which I think is fantastic. I think a lot of Catholics are very grateful for that, especially in the U.S.
It's almost impossible for a Pope not to enter the political fray as much as you want to be above partisanship. We've already seen from his brother, for example, said he's been not happy with critical of U.S. migration policy right now. What do you think his orientation implies?
Well, this is not meant to be glib, but his orientation is the gospel, and the gospel talks about welcoming the stranger. And popes have said this for generations. So he proclaims the gospel, and if it has a political sort of outcome, so be it, I think he feels. The Catholic Church has always been on the side of the migrant and the refugee. Jesus tells us to welcome the stranger. So he's been pretty clear so far, as Francis was clear. And I think the Church is going to continue to stand on the side of people who are the stranger. There's lots in the gospel that might be a little confusing, but when Jesus says, when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me, that's pretty clear.
The American that's been most public in talking about and engaging with Pope Leo so far has been Vice President. J.D. Vance, Catholic, has publicly been talking a lot about, well, actually, love thy neighbor. I mean, really, if you look at the Bible, it focuses first on yourself and your family and your community, and then you can talk about other people down the line. That's clearly not the reading that either you have or the Pope has. How public do you think the Pope should be
in discussing these sorts of things when he's engaging with U.S. political figures?
Well, sometimes directness is called for. Pope Francis wrote a response to this misinterpretation of what's called the Ordo Amoris, the order of love, which basically was misinterpreted to say that, family first and friends and then neighbors, and then maybe when you have something left over, to people on the outside. That is not Catholic teaching, right? And we are called to care for people that we don't know. I think Pope Francis was clear about that in the letter. The Pope and the Vatican decide when to be direct. Usually they're oblique. They don't want to be seen as sort of picking fights, right, or responding to individual people. And besides, the migration and refugee crisis is worldwide, so it's more likely that he's going to do something that's more universal. I mean, as I said before, it's the gospel, it's not politics, and they try to be diplomatic as well, to sort of also be neutral.
As someone who grew up in Catholic school myself, the world is very, very different today than it was when you and I were growing up. Opportunities are different, challenges are different. I'm wondering how you relate to that as someone who's devoted your life to Jesus Christ.
Well, I think, the United States is getting increasingly secular, right? And so we're moving away from religion in general. I think you could say that about the world. But there are pockets that are growing, and I think there's kind of a natural hunger for a relationship with God. I think that's part of who we are. And so I think if you remove it from people's lives, there's going to be this kind of responding hunger. And I think you do see that today, people looking for a sense of spirituality, if not religion. I think people are more turned off by religion than they are by spirituality. Yeah, I think the danger about spiritual but not religious, which is a popular way of saying it, is that you divorce yourself from the community. And as one Catholic once said, the community connects you and corrects you. So it connects you to other people. It's very hard to be spiritual by yourself. If you're spiritual just by yourself, sometimes the danger is, it's just me and God. And if it's just me and God, then whenever it pops into your head, it's okay, because I'm okay with God and God's okay with me. A community, I think, corrects you. So, for example, if you say, I never have to take care of poor people, because I'm fine with that. That's what God wants. The community and the history and the tradition are going to say, yeah, that's not exactly what we're talking about, and we'll push you a little bit and we'll challenge you. So there's a correction. There's also a connection. We're naturally social beings, and I think being by yourself with God is it's kind of untenable. You want to naturally be with people and worship God together. So I think that's, when you say spiritual but not religious, I think that's what people are sort of separating themselves from, that correction and that connection, and we need both.
So the interesting thing about the world today, of course, is that it is moving faster and faster at a time that many institutions, and the church is one of the most important, is, for good and for bad, like really much more stable. I think about artificial intelligence, which Pope Leo actually mentioned publicly early on, and the fact that in a very short period of time, human beings are going to be very different than they are right now, engaged with these new devices, changing who they are as people. How does the Catholic Church respond to the idea that humanity might not be Homo sapiens for long?
Well, the first thing is that there's a real reverence for the human person. I mean, that, human dignity, that's a foundational Catholic teaching, right? I mean, St. John Paul wrote about that very effectively. So that's the first thing. But I've actually been impressed with how on the ball the Vatican has been with AI. They've had a number of documents about it, conferences about it, and it's pretty amazing that Pope Leo would mention this in his first week. Now, Pope Leo XIII was responding with his first encyclical to the Industrial Revolution, and Leo XIV has said that there's another kind of revolution going on. So I would not be surprised if you saw an encyclical or some sort of major writing about AI. Yeah, the key is the focus on the human, the emphasis on the human, so that the human being doesn't just become, like a cog in a machine, which happened in the Industrial Revolution, right? But it will happen probably in, the AI revolution, but in a different way.
You've personally been very outspoken on issues that today many would consider woke. LGBTQ specifically, transgenderism in the United States right now has become, a touch the stove issue. Does this make it feel more urgent for you to lean in on those issues, or do you think actually maybe some went too far in progressivism and need to look towards things that will unify the country and the people better?
Well, it's like the parable of the Good Samaritan. When the guy is lying by the side of the road and has been beaten, we can either pass him by or help, right? And I think that LGBT people, and particularly transgender people, are really being treated like dirt these days in many parts of the world. And so we're called to help them. So I think the more that they are attacked, the more urgent it becomes for us to stand with them, right? It's really shocking to me that, particularly with the transgender community, which I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, it's such a minuscule part of the population. It's become this kind of outsized, almost focus for so many people. And I think what we really need to do is just, accompany them and be kind to them and listen to them. That's the first thing, because many people who are talking about it, I don't think I've ever met a transgender person in their life. So Pope Francis, on the other hand, met regularly with transgender people towards the end of his life, I think monthly. And he didn't change any doctrine on it, but he, met with them as human beings. This is part of human dignity, right? We treat people with dignity. If they're a migrant, if they're a refugee, if they're unborn, if they're an inmate, if they're on death row, if they're transgender. So it's all part of the treating people with dignity.
I was also impressed with his regular engagement, I guess it was every week, with this church in Gaza.
Every night.
Was it every night?
Every night.
Every night while the war was going on. Every night he found time for that, no matter where he was.
Yeah.
Yusuf. Buonasera, Santo Padre. Buonasera, come stai?
And they had little videos of him calling Holy Family, I think it's called, in Gaza. It's wonderful. I mean, he is the spiritual father of the church, and he's the spiritual father of this parish too. And I think just his desire to accompany people really came through. That's what one of the sort of themes of his papacy was: accompaniment, being with people, listening to people, meeting them one-on-one. And I think he did that very well. I mean, that's the very effective sign of his pastoral outreach. He's the pastor.
So in terms of the impact he had on the church, what do you think he'll most be remembered for?
I think Francis will be remembered for the kind of person he was. Open, merciful, loving, compassionate, listening. In addition to the more ecclesial things he did, like his encyclical on the environment, which I think is revolutionary, Laudato Si. But I think they'll see in him someone who went to the margins and brought people in. One of his images, which he used at the very beginning of his papacy, was the church as a field hospital, which I'd never heard. And I kept thinking of like MASH, the old TV show where field hospital, people coming in and out.
Hawkeye right there.
Exactly.
See, you got to move.
Well, right. Yeah. And taking care of people who are wounded, providing a rest stop for people, calling people in. I think that's a really beautiful image of the church. And I think he was someone who really put that into action. I mean, whether or not it was meeting with transgender people or calling a church in Gaza, right, or standing up for the environment, he's really calling people into this place of welcome.
Father James Martin, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
That's our show this week. Come back next week. And if you like what you've seen, or even if you don't, but you think you should have been selected Pope, white smoke for you, why don't you check us out at GZEROmedia.com.
Funding for GZERO World is provided by our lead sponsor, Prologis, and by Cox, a family of businesses. Additional funding provided by Jerry and Mary Joy Stead, Carnegie Corporation of New York, and